and then turn it over to Jacob Payne, our principal planner.
Thanks for the introduction, Shauna. So as Shauna said, I'm Jacob Payne. I'm a principal planner with the City of Tempe's Community Development Department. And I'm here today to talk about our proposed ordinance for a middle housing overlay district and how it relates to recent state legislature. So I'll start off with giving you kind of an overview of what the House Bill 2721 or the Middle Housing Bill is and what it contains. I'll talk about how the City of Tempe has drafted an ordinance in order to comply with this state law. We'll talk a little bit about meeting timelines and adoption for the future before opening it up for question and answer. So House Bill 2721, or as it's known as the Middle Housing Bill, this was passed last summer. It's one of a number of bills that the state legislature has put forward with the implicit purpose of expanding Arizona's housing supply. So what this one is looking to do is to increase the number of homes in single-family zone properties in proximity to downtown areas in the state and to streamline the permitting and review process for those units. So what House Bill 2721 requires is that any municipality in the state of Arizona that has 75,000 or more people shall allow duplexes, triplexes, fourplexes, and townhomes on lots that are zoned for single family within 1 mile of their central business district, which I'll get into what that means for Tempe in the next coming slides, as well as on at least 20% of any new residential development that is more than 10 contiguous acres. And that could be anywhere within the city, even if it's beyond the 1 mile of the central business district. So as we mentioned on the previous slide, they're talking about proximity to what they call the central business district. In the House bill, they've defined this as being the area that is designated by the municipality that primarily non-industrial attracts community activity and includes the area that we've designated as our downtown equivalent. So what you see on this map, and you'll see in later maps depicting the overlay district for Tempe, what this means for us as far as our downtown area is that those places that you see in the red, that's where we have what we call our city center zoning. So for the purposes of drawing that 1 mile from our central business district, that will be the area that we're using to consider as our downtown equivalent. In that state law, there's a couple things that we're not allowed to do through our ordinance actions. So these include any type of requirement actions, permitting, citing things that might make the development of middle housing impractical. We cannot restrict middle housing types to less than 2 floors or restrict them to a floor area ratio or lot coverage of less than 50%. We can't require any restrictions, permitting, or review processes that are more restrictive than what we would normally do for a single family home within the same district. We also can't require owner occupancy of the structure on the lot, require them to comply with commercial building code or contain a fire sprinkler, or require that these units contain more than 1 off-street parking space per unit. Things that the bill continues to allow us to do is to allow single-family dwellings in those areas where their zoning still allows for it, and also to include any additional types of middle housing that aren't implicitly written in the bill. Then there's a couple of exempted areas that the House bill includes. For Tempe, the ones that are going to apply are those ones that are areas that are not zoned for single-family residential, and those areas within the vicinity of an airport, which for us is Sky Harbor International Airport. And on the following slides, you'll see a map that shows what the vicinity of Sky Harbor looks like. So our ordinance to comply with this that we've put out is designed to be as an overlay district. So what overlay districts are is they are zoning that is put on top of the existing zoning that a property has and adds to essentially the provisions of what's allowed and what the standards would be. So on the following slide, I'll show you the map of what the 1 mile area looks like and where the zoning overlay will fall. But additionally, as we mentioned in the bill, this would also apply for any single family residential development of greater than 10 acres. And so that would work on an opt-in basis. So any of these developments that are greater than 10 acres would be allowed to opt into the middle housing district and dedicate up to 20% of their area towards middle housing typology. So this is the map that's been available online. So as you can see that hole in the donut in the middle, that's the area that we talked about in a previous slide as Tempe's Central Business District. The black hatched lines are extending 1 mile from that boundary. So within the area, you'll see yellow. That's where single family zoning exists currently. And then the red kind of blob that covers most of the Town Lake area, that's the airport vicinity as defined in state statute as being the area with the average 60 decibel noise. So those areas are excluded. So the areas where the overlay will be effective are going to be anything that's yellow within the hatched area that is not under the red area. So in the overlay, the following standards are going to apply. That duplexes, triplexes, fourplexes, and up to 4 townhome units are allowed per lot. Per the state statute, there will be a requirement of 1 on-site parking space per unit. As mentioned, there's can't be restrictions that are more restrictive than what we currently have for single-family zoning or in single-family properties in the same zone. So the height is going to be allowed to what the underlying zoning's limit would be. So in most single-family zoning in the city of Tempe, there's a 30-foot height limit. So that would still apply to middle housing. Setbacks are also going to be the same as what the underlying zoning would have. That does vary depending on the single-family zoning, but typically that's like 20 from the front, 5 from the sides, and 15 in the rear in the R16, which is what most single-family neighborhoods in Tempe have. As mentioned before, we cannot restrict lot coverage to less than 50%. So this does represent a little change from what underlying zoning would permit. Most single-family zoning districts have a 45% lot coverage maximum. So processing for middle housing that would propose to be developed in the area. It would start with the developer or property owner who's interested in redeveloping in middle housing or fixing an existing structure into a middle housing project. They would apply for a development plan review, which is a planning review to make sure that setbacks and height of the building, parking, those things are satisfied per code. And that's conducted and approved by city staff. Following that, they would apply for their building permits, which are also reviewed, inspected, and issued by city staff. And then something to note is that even though these are administrative processes, the standard processes for deviation from development standards, like a reduction in a setback or an excess of height, those would still incur processes that they would as if it were a single family home. So that could be a use permit or a variance. I wanted to mention, since there's been a number of other housing-related ordinances and statutes that have passed in recent years, to talk about where middle housing falls in line with these and kind of talk about how they might affect different properties. So one that you might have heard of is accessory dwelling units, which the city of Tempe has adopted an ordinance to that effect as of January this year. So these are attached or detached secondary dwellings on a single family lot. So for middle housing, ADUs would not be allowed in tandem with these developments, since a middle housing development, like a duplex or a triplex, they're not single family units. Another one is the adaptive reuse of office and commercial buildings. That's another ordinance that the city's passed recently based on a state law. This one's relating to reusing obsolete commercial or office buildings for multifamily housing. So the set of properties that ordinance affects is different than the ones that are affected by ADUs or by middle housing. So moving forward from here, per the statute, cities and towns must have an ordinance adopted to allow middle housing by January 1st of 2026. So we're processing this as a zoning overlay. So we're going through what we would normally do for any type of zoning amendment in the city of Tempe. So the first stop is today. This is our neighborhood meeting that we're hosting. So there's this meeting today over Zoom, and then it will be in person this evening at 5:30 at Clark Park with the same presentation. Following that, this item will go for a recommendation from the city's Development Review Commission on September 9th, before going to City Council for an introduction and final hearing on the 16th of October and then the 6th of November. We still have online a comment card that will be open until August 26th, at which point this ordinance will be attached with the Development Review Commission packet. And then we can receive public input through our public hearing processes. So with that, this is the contact information for the project team, and I would at this time open it up for any comments or questions.
Okay, thank you, Jacob. So we do have some questions in the chat that we're going to take. And then once we get through those, if anyone else has questions, please put them in the chat, or you're welcome to raise your hand and we'll get to those as well. So the first question is asking you to address historical districts and protection of historical housing.
Thanks. Yeah, so that is one thing that was not included as an exclusion of this bill, which we did try to get an amendment through the state legislature to do so. So other bills that we've seen relating to increasing housing stock have exempted any historic designated properties or districts. This one noticeably did not. So there was at one point an amendment proposed in the state legislature to exclude these areas, but it was not passed.
Okay, the next question, can this ordinance be expanded to include the whole city and not just the city center near the business district? It would be a good small step for addressing the housing crisis. There's a lot more space beyond the 1 mile limit in this ordinance.
Sure. I'll start talking about that, and then Ryan, if you have any thoughts you want to add too. Right now, this is not what we're considering doing with this ordinance, just because of the implication on the neighborhoods that would be affected. The city of Tempe has other avenues that we've tried to increase the city's housing stock through more deliberate efforts that still retain character in some of the single-family neighborhoods throughout the city. Especially without having an exemption for historic districts and properties with an ordinance like this. We think that it would be a better idea to try and come up with other avenues for ways to increase housing throughout the city rather than through the middle housing ordinance that we're proposing right now.
Yeah, thank you, Jacob. I'd also add that, this is the state mandated requirement is 1 mile from the defined central business district. If we were to take an approach of going any farther than that, then that would be something that would be on a voluntary basis from the city, considering that, knowing that we have other single-family neighborhoods in the surrounding area that are defined as cultural resource areas, where we've recommended in the general plan that those other existing single-family zone districts have the most appropriate density currently at their dwelling units per acreage that has been allowed for the original subdivision. So it'd be counter to the general plan designations to consider any development higher with duplexes, triplexes, or fourplexes. So it'd basically go against our general plan designation request. Although we're mandated by the state to do it with these provisions, we're adopting and conforming to the requirements set forth by the state, but not going any further than that. And that's our recommendation.
Thank you, Ryan. The next question asks you to explain opt-in more, please, and the process that requires public notice and council approval for opt-in.
Sure. So the opt-in is coming from the fact that the new statute requires that we allow middle housing on any residential development of greater than 10 acres. So instead of trying to come up with drawing that on any property that it might affect, we'll go with an opt-in process for that, where what will happen is if a property owner interested in developing for single family on a parcel that is 10 or more acres wants to opt in, they can designate up to 20% of that area towards middle housing, whether that be townhomes or duplex type buildings on 20% of the area of their property. It is an opt-in to the zoning overlay, but it would be processed administratively. So it would not be anything that would get noticed public for the addition of the overlay, and it would not have council approval.
Okay, next question. On the slide with the map of the overlay area, Could you show it again and verbally repeat what is the area? All yellow or yellow within the hatch circle area? And
Sure.
we'll put the website in the chat as well. The map is on there, so that way you can kind of zoom in more and see it a little easier.
Right. Yeah. So again, with the map, this area, you can all see my mouse, hopefully this area in the middle, that's kind of the keyhole of the buffer. That is what is Tempe's Central Business District for the purpose of this ordinance. The hatched area is the 1 mile that extends out from there. So from this end, that is the railroad tracks. So 1 mile takes you over to Priest Drive on the west. This bottom part is University Drive, which 1 mile south takes you to Broadway. On the east side, this is College Avenue. So 1 mile out is Dorsey from there. And then from the north up here, this is a little bit higher than the alignment of Curry. But this area also is kind of within that airport exemption. So that red is the 60 decibel average noise contour from Sky Harbor. So that area is excluded. So any of the yellow that's under the red is excluded from the overlay. The portions that will be part of the overlay will be any of the yellow that is within the hatched area that is not in the red area. And I'll leave this slide up while we answer some more questions just so that everybody can have a look at it too.
Next question is a lot coverage of 50% after the setbacks.
So the lot coverage and the setbacks will be two separate standards. So the setbacks will be taken away from the buildable area, and then the lot coverage is derived from the entire site area. So I will say that I did run in my mind a hypothetical on what that would look like for a typical single family lot, which is 60 feet by 100 feet. When you remove all of the setbacks, there's only about 54% of the lot that's remaining. So 50% would not constitute everything but the setbacks. There would still be some space inside the property as well. But the 50% lot coverage is taken from the entire site area.
Okay, next question. If current single-family zoning doesn't restrict number of bedrooms, then neither can this revision, correct? Each unit, townhouse, fourplex, etc., could have an unlimited number of bedrooms. Is this accurate?
This is correct. So we cannot restrict the number of bedrooms in a single family home, so that we couldn't do that in middle housing either. The limiting factor here, as far as to how many bedrooms that a unit in a duplex could have, is going to come down to what they can fit in that lot coverage, what they can fit within the height restrictions.
Next question, can the city limit how many middle houses per street, per block, or per neighborhood? And can we limit middle housing to not adjacent lots?
We cannot do that. So any property that would be in the overlay would be allowed to develop with middle housing. We couldn't set restrictions on individual lots based on adjacency to other middle housing projects or limit a number in a neighborhood.
The next question asked for a blown up version of the zone allowing additional housing. So as I mentioned, I did put the direct link to the website in there. And if you have trouble accessing that, please let me know. But otherwise, that way you can zoom in on the map and see it a little better. And then similar, I think, Jacob, you kind of answered this, but how do we prevent developers from buying 4 houses in a row and making a huge middle housing complex, which destroys the neighborhood?
Right. So one thing that I'll note with this particular ordinance is that we have that limit of 4 units, and that's per lot. So if somebody were buying multiple lots, they wouldn't be combining them to do this. It would be on each individual lot. Combining it, into one parcel would actually give them a lesser number, since it would be 1 lot instead of 2 or 3. But ultimately, yeah, there's no way that we could prevent what a private property owner wants to apply to do with a property. And if they've bought a property, they would be able to submit for middle housing, even if they're adjacent to one another.
Okay, next question, is water or lack of being considered in this development?
Yes. So one of the things that the state law does allow us to do is before we approve any middle housing application that's been submitted to us, we are permitted to make sure that there are adequate urban services, which would consider water availability as well.
Can the ordinance add protections for historical housing later or in the one?
I'll
I
I'll
could
have
answer
Ryan,
that.
yeah.
Yeah.
Um,
It's certainly possible. I mean, at a point, if this middle housing continues and stays in existence for 2 or 3 years, I may the opportunity for the state law to come in and clarify or exact certain other properties from the process. The time may be ticking on this, but certainly if the maybe next year's state legislature or a striker bill comes in, certainly could consider still exempting historic designated properties from this process. But at this time, unless the state does that themselves, then we're prohibited from making that type of restriction.
Okay, next question. You mentioned the bill has streamlining for the approval process. What can we expect that to look like?
Sure. So the streamlining that this process or that this ordinance and that this state law is intended to expedite is what would normally have a rezoning. So without having a middle housing overlay, a property owner with a single family home in a single family zoning district that wanted to build, a threeplex or a duplex, they would have to approach the city to rezone their property to a multifamily zoning district. And that would incur, neighborhood meetings with the city's Development Review Commission and the City Council to accomplish that, which would take months. So the streamlining that this bill and this ordinance is intended to speed up for middle housing is the removal of a rezoning process by laying this overlay that allows it by right.
And I think you answered this with your explanation of the map, but just going to repeat it. Is the 1 mile zone a buffer zone, or will multi-housing be permitted in the 1 mile zone?
It will be permitted within the 1 mile zone so long as the property has single family zoning and is not within the airport exclusion.
Okay, can you show the slide on reuse? It was the slide before the timeline of commercial buildings, and talk about reuse of commercial buildings. How might this fit the new law?
Sure. So what was being referenced there was a previous new state statute that related to using obsolete office and commercial buildings for multifamily housing. So that ordinance in our zoning code and then this middle housing ordinance would have a mutually exclusive set of properties that they're affecting. The adaptive reuse would deal with properties that typically would have commercial zoning or industrial zoning if it's an office building to be able to use those for multifamily housing. So this one is related to properties that have specifically single family zoning and in certain areas.
Okay, the next question is asking, how can the state think one parking place per unit is fair with the proximity to downtown?
I can't speak to what the state legislature was thinking as far as their parking requirements in the bill, but I think the general idea is that parking is usually a very expensive thing to design with a project, and this is an attempt to have the units in the project be more affordable by not having the developer have to pay for the improvements and site design that goes into accommodating more parking.
Okay, and then Jacob, a suggestion that they think the map would be clearer if the airport vicinity area within the hatch marks should not have hatch marks at all. It'd be much more clear that this area is excluded.
Okay.
And then next question, I know of a 40-acre property in Tempe that is attempting to get a rezoning. Please explain if or how opt-in could impact this property. The current zoning is Ag 1 house per acre.
Ryan, do you want to respond to that?
Yeah, certainly. So that would probably likely refer to the opt-in portion of this state law mandate for middle housing. That if you have a property of a consisting of at least 10, more than 10 acres of contiguous properties, meaning they're all adjoined or have the ability to combine the lots to be more than 10 acres, then that project or that new development could be eligible for incorporating middle housing into the project. What our current proposed ordinance states, and which meets the minimum requirements of the state law, is that 20% of that development area can designate middle housing units, meaning they could have duplexes, triplexes, fourplexes, or townhomes up to 4 units per lot in that design fashion. So that what that means is if you had a 40-acre development site, then you could identify 20% of those 40 acres to having lots that are consistent with single family, but also consistent with the guideline requirements of having duplexes, townhomes, or triplexes, fourplexes on their lot development without regard to actual underlying zoning density. And just to clarify too, the state says at least, that means cities or municipalities could identify more than 20%. We are proposing a maximum of 20% of that new development area, meaning it's an up to. So a developer could come in and say maybe they're only choosing to do 10% of the total new development with middle housing. That's okay. But the maximum threshold in this proposed ordinance would be a 20% allotment.
Okay, next question asks if historic preservation design guidelines will still be used in those districts.
I'll take a stab at that, and then if I get anything wrong, Ryan, feel free to chime in. So the historic preservation design guidelines mostly relates to properties that are designated on Tempe's local historic register. So if buildings are remaining and they're being modified to develop middle housing, I would think yes. If the building is not going to be there anymore, then no.
Yeah, it's an interesting scenario too. Historic historic designation overlay on a property. It's done by property owner's authorization, and that stays on with the property in the future when it changes hands. And so that gives the city and municipality the purview to have a review with their historic preservation commission. And if the result or desire maybe of demoing the historic home and proposing triplexes or fourplexes on the site, certainly could have a negative impact on the historic designation of the property, and the Historic Preservation Commission could appropriately decide that no, that's not appropriate, recommend or deny the demolition. They do have the authority to do that. They do have the authority to potentially stop a negative development that would impact the historic designation of a property if it's on the local listing. So yes, it definitely has an impact on the process and potential outcome. There are some scenarios where you could have or keep the historic home, and then the property owner decides to put a unit or a duplex on the back of the property and not impact the historic home. And that might be a scenario where you could see support from the Historic Preservation Commission because the historic home property that's the site's designated is remaining on the site.
Okay, next question. How many people unrelated can live in a dwelling?
I believe that number is 3.
Okay, and the next question,
Wait.
can the property,
Shauna, could you restate that question?
how many people unrelated can live in a dwelling? The consanguinity chart, Ryan.
Okay,
Yeah. Ryan, if you like, I'd take this.
sure, go ahead.
Yeah, hi, this is Jeff Tamulevich. I'm the director of the Community Development Department. So the maximum number of people in a dwelling is 3 unrelated. So you could have families much larger than 3, but the current code identifies that 3 unrelated is the maximum.
Thank you, Jeff. And I do need to clarify though, when we're talking about middle housing, it's a form of multifamily housing, and we would not be looking at specific restrictions as it pertains to
correct.
Number of people or number of unrelated people. You're in a multifamily housing category now that's being allowed in these single family zoning areas. So the code would not be consistent with the allowance for multifamily and the number of related or unrelated people living in a.
Correct. It would only pertain to the single family residence.
Correct.
Okay, next question. Can the property owner maintain the existing primary house and add up to 4 townhouses? And then also, how does this impact the ADU ordinance?
Good question. So it is possible to add units to the property and maintain the existing house for the development of middle housing. However, at maximum 4 units on the property. So that could be, dividing up the home into a duplex and putting a second duplex in the back for a total of 4 on the property, or adding 3 townhomes and the single home for a total of 4 as well. As far as talking about the ADU ordinance, there's going to be different restrictions on what those look like. So for an ADU, for example, if someone was to keep their home and build an ADU in the back, there's a size limitation on how large that ADU can be. It's 75% of the main home square footage, capped out at 1,000 square feet. And for ADUs, there is no plan review process through the planning department. Those would just go for building permits directly. So if someone was to build, a second unit in their backyard that was too big to be an ADU, it could be considered middle housing as a 2-unit duplex, and it would process through that avenue rather than as an ADU. So there's a lot of intricacies about how those two things will play together. But there's different provisions for each one that will determine how we would process them.
So to further clarify what Jacob was saying about the townhomes addition, keeping the main residence, you couldn't necessarily add 4 townhome units if you kept the main residence, because that's 4 plus 1, that would equal 5 units, 12 units on the lot. So you could add 3 townhomes as he suggested, and then the 4th being the original single family home on the property, or redevelop the entire property to 4 new townhome units.
Okay, next question. Can a neighborhood create a new HOA that would have multi-housing restrictions?
It is possible through CC&Rs to have restrictions that would not allow for middle housing development, similarly to how some neighborhoods have CC&Rs that prevent ADUs from being built. So that's hypothetically, yes. Creating new CC&Rs in an HOA in a neighborhood would probably be very difficult, but I'm not exactly sure what that process would look like for a neighborhood that's already established, rather than creating the CC&Rs in the HOA with the subdivision of the neighborhood itself. I don't know if Ryan or if Shauna, if you have any insight onto if that's ever happened, or what that looked like.
Jacob, you're right about that. These are much older subdivisions, much older neighborhoods. The likely that we have single family zoning with HOAs is very small. There might be some pockets of infill development there that have HOAs, but you might have some neighborhoods that have some underlying CC&R restrictions. It would certainly require the formation of properties agreeing to sign into a covenant agreement or revised CC&Rs that put those type of land restrictions on the property as a single subdivision or consistent properties that had the same regulation restrictions. It would require 100% of those property owners to consider making those type of changes.
And the only thing I would add is HOAs are regulated at the state level, so then they follow that process. The city doesn't have one to have, we aren't allowed to have neighborhoods follow HOA or form HOAs. That's up to the state and the restrictions they set. Related to urban services, can the property owner have a separate water meter for the primary residence and the multi-housing or middle housing, sorry, MH?
So layers to the answer to that. So the development of townhomes, which would be platted, fee simple, single family to be sold, right? Townhomes. Those would require separate water meters as their individual single family lots that would be being created. For duplexes, triplexes, fourplexes, or in your situation, building extra units that are separate from an existing main residence. I think it would go either way. I know for ADUs, we've already been having this discussion as to if there's a preference as far as metering goes. But I believe it would be open for the property owner to make that determination on what is the more logical solution for their project.
Okay, next one. Governor Hobbs specifically stated this bill will help mitigate the effects of rising costs to make life more affordable for everyday Arizonans. Can you clarify which portion of this amendment specifically addresses affordability?
Sure. So there are no direct provisions of this bill that require any of these units to be affordable. And I think the idea that this does help with the affordable has to do with increasing the supply, the number of units that are available as a way to reduce demand and bring housing prices down. But there's nothing in this statute that specifically says that any of the middle housing units need to be set affordable at any range.
Okay, next question. What is an example of 10-acre property that you mentioned? Is that only single-family zone 10-acre lots?
So that would apply to any single family zoned lots that are 10 acres, or if someone were to have multiple properties that together make up 10 contiguous acres. And the development would be single family with 10 or up to 20% of that being dedicated towards the middle housing component.
Okay, and then the next comment is asking about guest parking.
Sure. So in Tempe's zoning ordinance, we have a 0.2 space per unit guest parking provision. Because of this statute telling us that we can't ask for more than one off-street space per unit, we're not able to enforce that.
Just to clarify too, the property owner does have the option to propose more parking spaces on their site if they choose to. We just can't require it. So they may choose to have guest parking area. It just can't be regulated or mandated by the city.
Okay, next question. I understand state law does not require cities to allow middle housing in airport vicinity zones, but it also does not prohibit it. Given that there are already many existing homes, including single-family and multifamily, within the current airport exclusion area, what is the rationale for including this exclusion? And if residents or advocates wanted to pursue removing or shrinking this exclusion area, what would be the most effective way to go about that?
Sure. I'll start with a response to that, and then Ryan, if you want to add anything. But generally, the state includes these exclusions for public airport vicinities as a way to try and discourage what they would call incompatible land uses in those noise-sensitive areas. And a reason for that is that having incompatible land uses near an airport sometimes has implications for the airport's processes and how they might, need to apply for or receive any type of federal help or doing studies or getting grant funding. So in general, we tend to err on the side of caution when it comes to, promoting or encouraging or looking any way to intensify something that might be considered as an incompatible land use in the vicinity of an airport, which is why we're keeping the current defined exclusion into our ordinance.
Yeah, thank you, Jacob. Yeah, maybe as some of you may know or may not know, we have a intergovernmental agreement between the city of Phoenix Sky Harbor and the city of Tempe. We recently amended that, and some of the goals and efforts identified in that process are certainly to look at limiting the amount of private residential development within an airport vicinity or within specifically the 65 DNL line, contour line that affects noise levels. Certainly it's something we can probably reach out to our neighboring partner cities and discuss this potential provision and see if they have any questions or concerns if the city were to reduce the exception or adhere to a 65 DNL. It's certainly something we can discuss with our neighboring partners in the city of Phoenix and see what they say about that topic.
Okay, next question. It appears that Maple Ash District is exempt. What type of zoning is in that area?
Yeah, so the Maple Ash neighborhood, as well as portions of Wilson Art and Garden, just on the other side of the tracks, have what's R2 or R3 zoning. Those are already multifamily zoning districts. So you'll notice when you're in those neighborhoods that there are kind of a mix already of single family homes with some small multifamily 2 to 4 unit type developments. So in essence, like middle housing is already permitted in those areas in that effect through the zoning that already exists. The reason why they're not shown on this map is because the statute specifically applies to single family zoned properties.
Okay, and then Jeff, if you're still available, there's a question asking if the city enforces the 3 unrelated persons per single family home. And we can get back to you. Looks like Jeff had to drop off, so we'll follow up and let you know. Next question, if rezoning is required today, does that take precedent over opt-in? Meaning, does opt-in go around an existing zoning today? And he is specifically asking about the Shalimar property.
I'll start with that, and then Ryan, if you have anything to add, but the opt-in administrative rezoning process is only to add the middle housing overlay. So any other like rezoning that would take place would still go through the standard rezoning process. So in your previous message, you mentioned the 1 unit per acre zoning. If they wanted to, rezone to something more intense and add themselves to the middle housing, the rezoning from the 1 unit per acre to something more intense would go through a typical rezoning process. It's just the opting into middle housing overlay district would not.
You are correct, Jacob. Yeah, it could be a circumstance where you're just utilizing the existing zoning to consider middle housing or part of a bigger potential rezoning process that ensures a different single family zoning district with middle housing, but the middle housing portion would not be subject to the public hearing review process.
The next question is asking what is the multi-housing limit of people living, related or unrelated, in a home? And then Ryan, I don't know if you have them handy, or Janelyn, we can follow up after the meeting, but she's asking for the links for where those are in the code.
Okay. Yeah, well, you've got the city rental housing code that has occupancy limits. You also have the International Building Code that also limits the amount of occupancy in a certain size bedrooms or rooms. And those are dictated based on the floor area dedicated for that space for a living environment. We can certainly provide you some future references to those. I think the one that's most typically mostly enforced and regulated is our Tempe adopted building codes.
Okay, so then the next question is also related to that. We've already answered about limit for single family homes and multifamily, but asking, does Tempe have the ability to set the limit within this overlay district?
Well, yeah, again, we'd have to refer the readers back to our Uniform Building Code and Rental Housing Code for those limitations that are citywide and are based on the renting of a unit or a dwelling unit space and what those occupancy requirements are.
So Ryan, any change would have to come through those, not through the overlay district. Is that correct?
Correct, yes.
Next question, does it have to be at least 2 units to qualify for middle housing, or could it simply be 1 residence? And it sounds like the total number of units is capped at 4. So if a property has a primary residence, an ADU unit, then it could still add a duplex. Is that correct?
Yes, so it does have to be at least 2 units to qualify for middle housing. Otherwise, if it's just one, that's a single family property and would be permitted by the zoning underlying anyway. And the total number per lot, yes, is capped at 4. So a property that maybe had a primary residence and an ADU that wants to become a 4-unit complex could add an additional 2 units to the property to get to that point, pursuant to sending us, the city, a development plan review to make sure that they're accommodating all of the proper development standards and parking on the site.
And I just want to clarify too, there may be some circumstances on people's size of properties that will not afford or not allowed to get the total maximum number of 4 units on the property, maybe due to lot coverage or setback constraints. It's the responsibility of the applicant to show that they have a code compliant property project site. The site may limit 3, it may only limit 2. It depends on how they show that design. And if somebody needs relief from the code, like setbacks or lot coverage or height, then they have to go through those standard variance or hearing processes that have to get extra technical review that require then public input on the process. So no guarantees on the 4 units, but they do have to work within the development standards of the underlying zoning district.
Okay, would a deed restriction that people individually put on their homes prevent middle housing on that individual property? As opposed to an HOA, perhaps individual property owners could prevent their properties from being sold that way.
Yeah, Jacob, I can answer this one. Yes, they certainly could put that deed restriction on there, but again, it's not the city's responsibility to enforce or regulate such deed restriction. It's the individual property owners. It's a civil matter. You just got to make sure that if you are putting in deed restrictions, that you have some enforcement mechanism to follow up on that at a later time. And if someone chooses to ignore their own deed restrictions, then that's their responsibility, and they could be held liable if somebody chooses to make that fight in court. But again, the city won't monitor, we won't regulate or enforce CC&Rs or deed restrictions.
Okay, question if the parking space is part of the 50% coverage.
So lot coverage is calculated based on the enclosed area of buildings on the property. So parking that would be located in a garage would count towards that. Parking that's surface would not be.
Okay, and then one of our attendees missed the answer to his question. So Jacob, can you repeat if the 1 mile zone is a buffer zone, or will multi-housing be permitted in that 1 mile zone?
Right, yeah. I know, and I think in future graphics it won't be called a buffer because it might be drawing a little confusion, but this is showing what that 1 mile looks like from our downtown, and middle housing will be permitted within it. So the yellow within the within the the 1 mile extension from the downtown.
And Jacob, we're working on some interactive maps that can provide a little bit closer in depth that'll specifically show which properties are in the overlay.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, the next question asks about the process for getting residential permit parking. I'll drop that in the chat. That's out of our transportation department, so they are the best ones to answer any questions about that. But the suggestion is that might be how a neighborhood could reduce the impact of the unlimited parking aspect. Okay, next question. How many historical areas would a change with city airport MOU impact? In other words, how many historical areas are in the map that are pink and not pink?
So right now, within this 1 mile extension from the downtown, there are 2 designated historic districts. So there's I think it's the Roosevelt Edition, and then this one down here is University Park, and then a number of individually listed properties. So if Jana, you're referring to if we were to work out with Sky Harbor about changing the exclusion to a smaller area, if historic properties within the exclusion would now become eligible, There would be at least this one district, as well as probably a couple individually designated properties within the exclusion area currently.
Okay, question asking if there's anything to prevent these from being turned into short-term rentals.
Ryan, do you?
No, to my knowledge, the state did not address short-term rental regulations regarding the use of the middle housing. So someone would have the ability to designate one or more of the units for short-term rental use. Again, recognizing that these are rental, units intended to be rented for the most part, unless you're proposing a townhome, but there would be no restrictions on whether one can rent for short-term use or rent for long-term, more than 30 days. Unless the state revises their rules and regulations again.
Okay, if someone's property value declines when a fourplex is built next door, would they have a claim under Arizona Revised Statute 12-1134, the law that provides protection for property owners against reduction in property values due to new land use laws?
That would be assuming you're challenging that the state has created this situation of diminishing your property value. You'd have to take that up with the state legislature, I guess. Again, we're following the mandate that's being dictated by the municipalities with 75,000 population or more. So, and this, we typically wouldn't be able to do this overlay process ourselves because of our own general plan, land use designations and restrictions that would not allow us to convert or change single family zoning. But the state, by virtue of their own mandates enforced by the state laws, gives us that ability to do that now because we have to conform to these process and procedures. So
Okay, and the
I
next,
would say, in short, that would be a challenge that the state would have to take into consideration.
thanks, Ryan. So I'm going to put the website again. The question was asking about a recording, so it will be posted there. It does take us a couple days to convert it, to be able to post it and share. So just give it a little bit and then it'll be on there. Then the next question is asking for clarification on Shalimar. Can the developer use this middle housing ordinance to work around, to work around requiring the zoning process for all or any part of that specific property?
If the developer of Shalimar posts the adoption of this on January 1, decides to use more than 10 acres of their property for new development, they could utilize the middle housing opt-in portion of this provision for such purposes. It's possible.
Okay, the next question is asking about taxes on a lot with a single family and 2 ADUs versus a lot with 4 middle housing.
I don't know the specifics on that. This is something that's already come up for discussion based on ADUs in general, and having ADUs on lots and whether that is affecting people's tax. But it's a question that we would have to figure out from the county assessor based on their property use codes and how developing middle housing might change what the property's use is and how that's taxed. So I don't have an answer at this moment, but we can look into that and figure out something to have available online.
Okay, then the next question was asking for clarification on what a CC&R is, and that stands for covenants, conditions, and restrictions. So for those property owners living within a HOA, it's the legal documents you sign that you'll be allowed to be governed under those additional rules versus your city, state, other zoning rules. And Ryan, you can clarify as well if you'd like to add to that.
You hit the nail on the head, Shauna. You got it right.
Okay. All right, let's see. So I appreciate the explanation about the rationale behind the airport exclusion area and understand you mentioned that if the city of Tempe and neighboring cities are interested, the exclusion zone could potentially be revisited. I was wondering though, is there an appropriate or formal way for residents or advocates to help initiate or support that process? What would be the best way for the public to get involved if there's interest in shrinking the exclusion area? Or is this something the public is unable to get involved in?
Good question. I think it's probably appropriate, at least the city organization who we have contacts with the City of Phoenix officials. We can certainly pose those questions. We meet with them on a monthly basis, with our aviation commission as well too. So certainly an item we can bring up, broach, and get feedback from them. But as always, someone wants to reach out to public officials or council members within the City of Phoenix, you have every right to do so.
And Jacob, do you maybe want to share the slide that shows the process again? So if there were, for example, modifications or changes, you can follow along the timeline there. Next question is asking, does ingress and egress for the middle housing have to come off of the municipal street, or could it be accessed from the alley?
It's possible to have some access from the alley. It's going to be dependent on some of the site conditions, though. There are some alleys in Tempe that are wider than others, some that have different pavement conditions. But currently, there are allowances for alley access for single-family properties, and being as we can't do anything that would be more restrictive than how we handle single-family properties, it would continue to be a possibility for middle housing as well.
Yes, that's true. And there have been some known restrictions on accessing public alleys that are substandard widths.
Mm-hmm.
The goal is to be able to use it if it's at least 20 feet wide, public alleys.
Okay, that was all the questions. There's some thank yous and some oh wait, a couple are coming in, so we'll come back to those in a minute here. And some statements that will be captured. Before we get to the next question, in case some of you drop off, I am including the comment form in the chat as well. Comment through that format is open through August 26th. And then after that, you would need to follow for the Development Review Commission, City Council. They have their own comment procedures that you can find with their websites, or if you we can keep you all updated via the email you provided joining us today. So back to Shalimar, if the developer files to opt into middle housing to property in January, the rezoning being requested is still required before any construction, correct? Meaning rezoning approval first, then middle housing, or any other development?
We still have a pending zoning amendment application on file. It's up to the developer if they choose to go forward with that project or withdraw it and propose a new plan. So at this time, it's uncertain as to when that project will hit public hearings or if they plan to complete what's being proposed at this time. So it's really an unknown factor. You can make your own assessments of whether or not they'd want to consider changing it or starting all over. But at this time, they've made no considerations of any further amendments. We've kind of been in a waiting standpoint since they held their neighborhood meetings in the summer.
Okay, thank you everyone for joining us. Again, the timeline is there. And Jacob, did you have any other closing comments?
No, you can stay updated with the project over at tempe.gov/proposed code changes. And like I said, we still have the online comment form that'll be open until the 26th. And at that point, it will be advertising for those public hearings, and you can give feedback that way as well. But appreciate everybody taking the time today.
Thank you, everyone.